The dog knew, before anyone else suspected, before the whispers started, before the shadows in that house grew too heavy to ignore. The dog knew. Max, a scruffy mutt with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories, would growl low and guttural whenever Richard stepped into the room. Not the playful bark of a pet greeting its owner, but something primal, something that made the hairs on your neck stand up. Emily noticed it first, though she didn't think much of it at the time. Just a dog being a dog, she told herself. But looking back, that was the first crack in the perfect little life she thought she'd built. Emily was 28, newly married to Tom, and still adjusting to the whirlwind of moving from her cozy apartment in Chicago to a sprawling house in rural Michigan. Tom's family had roots here, deep ones, and the house belonged to his father, Richard, a man who carried himself like he owned not just the property, but the air everyone else breathed. Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was the kind of man who could make you feel small with a single glance, though he'd never raise his voice. Emily didn't know him well, not yet. They'd only met a handful of times before the wedding, and each encounter left her with a vague unease she couldn't pin down. Maybe it was the way he'd linger on her words, as if weighing them for hidden meanings. Or maybe it was just her, overthinking things, trying too hard to fit into this new family. Tom, on the other hand, was her anchor. Sweet, dependable Tom, with his easy laugh and his habit of leaving sticky notes with doodled hearts on her coffee mug. He'd grown up in this house, under Richard's shadow, and yet he seemed untouched by the weight of it. When he proposed, Emily hadn't hesitated. She loved him fiercely, and the idea of building a life together, even in a place as unfamiliar as this, felt like an adventure. The house was a gift, Tom had said. His father wanted them to start their marriage here, to keep the family close. Emily, eager to please, agreed. She didn't know then that the house would feel less like a gift and more like a cage. The first few weeks were a blur of unpacking boxes, painting walls, and trying to make the place their own. The house was old, creaky, with too many rooms, and a faint musty smell that no amount of cleaning could erase. Max, Richard's dog, came with the package. Richard had moved into a smaller place a few miles away after handing over the keys, but he'd left Max behind, saying the dog belonged to the house. Emily didn't mind. She'd always loved dogs, and Max was a good companion. Loyal, quiet, curling up at her feet while she worked on her freelance graphic design projects. But there was something about the way Max watched Richard during his visits. The dog would stiffen, his ears pinned back, a low rumble in his throat. Richard would laugh it off, call Max temperamental, but Emily caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance? Fear? She couldn't tell. Life settled into a rhythm, or at least it seemed to. Tom worked long hours at the local hardware store, a job he'd taken to stay close to home. Emily spent her days designing logos and tweaking websites, grateful for the flexibility that let her work from anywhere. Richard would stop by every few days, always unannounced, always with a reason that felt flimsy. He'd bring a bottle of wine, or say he needed to check the furnace, or claim he'd left something in the attic. Each time he'd linger, asking Emily questions that felt too personal, about her childhood, her parents, her plans for kids. She'd answer politely, chalking it up to a father-in-law trying to bond. But the way he listened, the way he watched her, made her skin prickle. Then there was the night that changed everything. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and Tom was still at the store covering a late shift. Emily was in the living room, curled up with a book. Max sprawled across the rug. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. That's when she heard it, a faint thud from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. Max's head snapped up, his ears perked, and before Emily could move, he was on his feet, bolting toward the staircase. Her heart kicked up a notch. The house was old, noises weren't unusual, but this felt different. Wrong. She grabbed her phone, hesitating. Call Tom? The police? Over a noise? She felt silly even considering it. Instead, she followed Max, her bare feet cold against the hardwood. The dog was already at the top of the stairs, his body rigid, staring down the dark hallway toward the attic door. Emily's pulse thrummed in her ears. The attic was Richard's domain. He'd told them not to bother with it, that it was full of junk from his years in the house. She'd never had a reason to go up there, but now, with Max growling softly and the air feeling heavier than it should, she couldn't shake the urge to check. The attic door was ajar. Just a crack, but enough to make her stomach twist. She was sure it had been closed before. She reached for the knob, her hand trembling, and pushed it open. The stairs beyond were narrow, swallowed by darkness. Max pressed against her leg, his warmth grounding her. "It's fine," she whispered, more to herself than the dog. She flicked on her phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. Step by step she climbed, the air growing colder, mustier. At the top, the attic was a maze of boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs. Nothing seemed out of place, but the silence was oppressive, like the room was holding its breath. Then she saw it, a trunk in the corner, its lid slightly open, papers spilling out. She didn't know why it caught her eye, but something about it felt off, like it didn't belong. Max whined, nudging her hand, but she stepped closer, her flashlight shaking. The papers were old, yellowed, some handwritten, some typed. She crouched, her fingers brushing the top sheet. It was a letter, the ink faded but legible. "You can't keep this buried forever," it read. "I know what you did." The signature was smudged, unreadable. Her breath caught. What the hell was this? Another noise, a creak from the stairs. Max barked, sharp and loud, and Emily spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The attic was empty, the stairs dark, but the air felt charged, like someone had been there, or was still there, just out of sight. She shoved the letter back into the trunk, her hands clumsy, and grabbed Max's collar, pulling him toward the stairs. She didn't stop until she was back in the living room, the door locked, her phone clutched tight. The letter's words burned in her mind. What did Richard do? And why did it feel like the house itself was trying to tell her? She didn't sleep that night. Tom came home, exhausted, and she didn't tell him about the attic. Not yet. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't know what she'd found, or maybe because she was afraid of what he'd say. But as she lay in bed, Max curled up at her feet. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something dangerous, something Richard didn't want her to know. And the dog, with his unblinking eyes and his quiet growls, seemed to agree. What was Richard hiding? And how long could Emily pretend everything was fine? Emily couldn't look at Richard the same way after that night. Every time he came by, his easy smile and booming voice felt like a mask, hiding something jagged beneath. The letter she'd found in the attic, those words, "I know what you did," clawed at her thoughts, relentless. She hadn't gone back to the trunk, hadn't dared to dig deeper, but the weight of it sat heavy in her chest, like a secret she wasn't supposed to carry. Max too seemed different. The dog shadowed her every move now, his eyes sharp, his body tense whenever Richard's truck rumbled up the driveway. Emily told herself she was imagining things, that she was letting a single piece of paper unravel her. But the house didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like it belonged to Richard's past, and she was just a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Tom noticed her distance, though he didn't push. "You okay, Em?" he'd ask, his brow furrowed, and she'd force a smile, blaming late nights and deadlines. She wanted to tell him about the letter, about the creak on the attic stairs, about the way Max growled at his father like he was a stranger. But something held her back. Tom idolized Richard. He'd grown up hearing stories of his father's strength, his work ethic, the way he'd built a life for them from nothing. To Tom, Richard was a pillar, unshakable. Emily wasn't sure how to crack that foundation without breaking something else, so she kept quiet, and the silence grew thorns. It was a Tuesday, gray and damp, when the next piece fell into place. Emily was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, when Richard showed up unannounced. Again. He had a toolbox in one hand, claiming the shed's roof needed patching before the next storm. Max was at the back door, scratching to be let in. But the moment Richard stepped inside, the dog froze, his hackles up, a low snarl curling from his throat. Richard chuckled, but it was tight, forced. "That mutt's got a screw loose," he said, setting the toolbox on the counter with a thud. Emily's stomach twisted. She mumbled something about Max being protective, but her eyes caught the way Richard's hand lingered near the toolbox, fingers twitching like he was itching to grab something. He stayed longer than he needed to, talking about the weather, the town, anything but the shed. Emily nodded along, her responses clipped, her mind racing. She kept seeing that letter, the smudged signature, the threat woven into those faded words. When Richard finally left, the air in the house felt lighter, like a storm cloud had passed. But Max didn't relax. He paced the kitchen, whining softly, his nose pressed to the floor where Richard had stood. Emily crouched beside him, stroking his fur. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "What do you know that I don't?" That evening, she couldn't shake the urge to look again. Tom was at the store, the house was quiet, and the attic seemed to call to her, its pull magnetic. She grabbed a flashlight, her heart pounding, and climbed the stairs with Max at her heels. The trunk was exactly as she'd left it, the lid still ajar, papers spilling like secrets too heavy to stay contained. She knelt, her hands trembling, and started sifting through the contents. There were more letters, dozens of them, some in the same handwriting as the first, others in different scripts. They were vague but menacing. Phrases like, "You'll pay for it," and "No one forgets." Mixed in were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, about a missing woman from 20 years ago. A local, someone named Margaret Klein. The articles were sparse, mentioning a search that fizzled out, a case that went cold. Emily's breath hitched. Why would Richard keep these? Then she found the photograph. Tucked beneath a stack of letters, it was creased and faded, showing a younger Richard, maybe in his 30s, standing beside a woman with sharp cheekbones and a guarded smile. They were outside, the house looming in the background. On the back, in looping script, someone had written, R&M, 2003. M. Margaret? Emily's mind spun. She didn't know what it meant, but the pieces felt like they were snapping together, forming a picture she wasn't ready to see. Max whined, nudging her arm, and she realized she was shaking. She stuffed the photo and a few letters into her pocket, closed the trunk, and hurried downstairs, her pulse roaring. She didn't know what to do with what she'd found, but the idea of staying silent felt suffocating. When Tom got home, she was waiting for him in the living room, the papers spread out on the coffee table. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Tom's face fell, his eyes flicking to the papers, then back to her. "What's this, Em?" She told him everything. The noise in the attic, the first letter, Max's behavior, the trunk, the photo. Her words tumbled out, frantic, and she hated how unhinged she sounded. Tom listened, his expression unreadable. But when she mentioned Margaret Klein, something shifted. His jaw tightened, and for a split second, she thought she saw fear in his eyes. "This is crazy," he said finally, his voice low. "You're jumping to conclusions. Dad's not... he's not some kind of monster." "I'm not saying that," Emily snapped, though part of her wondered if she was. "But this isn't nothing, Tom. These letters, the photo. Why does he have them? And why is Max so scared of him?" Tom shook his head, rubbing his temples. "Max is just a dog, Em. And those papers, they could be anything. Old junk. You don't know." The argument went nowhere. Tom didn't want to hear it. Didn't want to entertain the idea that his father could be hiding something. He kept saying she was stressed, that moving to the house had been a lot, that she needed to let it go. But the more he dismissed her, the more betrayed she felt. She'd trusted him to be her partner, to listen, but he was choosing Richard over her. That night they slept in the same bed, but the space between them felt like a chasm. The next morning, Emily woke to find Tom gone. A note on the counter said he'd left early for work, but it felt like an excuse. She was alone with Max, the house creaking around her, the papers still on the coffee table. She couldn't stop rereading the letters, couldn't stop staring at the photo of Richard and the woman who might be Margaret. Her mind flashed to moments she'd brushed off. Richard's probing questions, his unannounced visits, the way he'd linger in doorways, watching her. Had he known she'd find the trunk? Was he testing her? The breaking point came that afternoon. Richard showed up again, this time with no excuse. Just a bottle of whiskey and a smile that made her skin crawl. Max went ballistic, barking and snapping until Emily had to drag him to the back porch. Richard sat at the kitchen table, pouring himself a glass, his eyes never leaving her. "You seem tense, Emily," he said, his voice smooth but edged. "Everything okay with you and Tom?" She froze, her hands gripping the counter. There was something in his tone, a challenge, like he knew she'd been digging. "We're fine," she managed, but her voice cracked. Richard tilted his head, his smile widening. "Good. Family's everything, you know. You don't want to go stirring up trouble where there's none." It wasn't a question. It was a warning. And as he leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass, Emily felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. Richard wasn't just hiding something. He was dangerous. And she was trapped in his house, with his secrets, and a husband who wouldn't believe her. Max's barks echoed from the porch, frantic, desperate. And Emily realized she was running out of time. What had Richard done? And what would he do to keep it buried? Emily's world was unraveling, thread by thread, and she could feel it. The house, once a symbol of her new life with Tom, now felt like a trap, its walls closing in with every creak and shadow. Richard's visit had left her shaken, his words, "You don't want to go stirring up trouble," ringing in her ears like a threat she couldn't unhear. Max's frantic barks from the porch had only deepened her dread, the dog's instincts screaming what her mind was too afraid to fully accept. Richard was not who he seemed, and whatever he was hiding, it was tied to this house, to those letters, to the ghost of Margaret Klein. She hadn't spoken to Tom since their argument. He'd been distant, leaving early and coming home late, his silence louder than any words. Emily didn't know if he was angry, ashamed, or just unwilling to face the truth about his father. Either way, the rift between them grew, and she felt more alone than ever. Max was her only ally now, his presence a quiet comfort as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The letters, the photo, the newspaper clippings, they were clues, but they weren't enough. She needed more, even if the thought of digging deeper made her stomach churn. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Emily jumped at every noise, checked the locks twice before bed, and kept the attic door in her peripheral vision. She stopped answering Richard's calls, letting them go to voicemail, his voice unnervingly calm as he left messages about stopping by to check on things. She didn't tell Tom about the visits or the voicemails. She wasn't sure he'd care, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. Max sensed it too, his growls sharper, his eyes always fixed on the door. It was a cold, foggy morning when everything came to a head. Emily was in the kitchen, staring at the photo of Richard and the woman she now believed was Margaret Klein. She'd been scouring the internet for more information, piecing together scraps from old articles and forums. Margaret had been 32 when she vanished, a teacher at the local high school, well-liked but private. The police had questioned a few people, including an unnamed local man, but no arrests were made. The case faded, forgotten by everyone except, it seemed, Richard. Emily's fingers traced the woman's face in the photo, her heart heavy. Had Richard known her, loved her, hurt her? The sound of tires on gravel snapped her out of her thoughts. She shoved the photo under a stack of papers, her pulse racing. Max was already at the door, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Emily peered through the window and saw Richard's truck, the man himself climbing out with a purposeful stride. No toolbox this time, no bottle of whiskey. Just Richard, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the house. She considered not answering the door, but the thought of him letting himself in was worse. With a deep breath, she opened it. Max pressed against her leg, his teeth bared. "Emily," Richard said, his voice smooth but cold, like ice over a river. "We need to talk." He didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past her into the living room. Max lunged, barking furiously, and Emily had to grab his collar to hold him back. Richard didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. "Get that dog under control," he snapped, the first crack in his composure. She dragged Max to the back porch, her hands shaking, and locked the door. When she returned, Richard was standing by the coffee table, his eyes locked on the papers she'd left out. The letters, the clippings. Her heart stopped. She hadn't meant to leave them exposed, but it was too late. Richard's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, she saw something raw in his expression, anger maybe, or fear. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Emily's mouth went dry. She could lie, say they were nothing, but the truth was clawing its way out, and she was tired of hiding. "I found them in the attic," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Letters, articles, about Margaret Klein, and you." She paused, watching his face, searching for a reaction. "Why do you have them, Richard? What happened to her?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard didn't move, didn't blink, but the air around him seemed to shift, heavy with something unspoken. Then he laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made Emily's skin crawl. "You've been busy," he said, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "Digging through things that don't concern you. You think you're clever, don't you?" "I'm not trying to be clever," she shot back, her fear giving way to anger. "I just want the truth. Who was she? Why is her name all over those papers? And why does Max hate you so much?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated how vulnerable it made her sound. But she was done pretending, done tiptoeing around the man who'd made her feel like an intruder in her own home. Richard's face darkened, his smile gone. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You're stirring up ghosts, Emily. Things that should stay buried. You keep this up, you're gonna regret it." He took another step, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of his cologne, and her body screamed at her to run. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her hands clenched, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might burst. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. He turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The house shook, and Emily sank to the floor, her legs giving out. Max's barks echoed from the porch, desperate, and she realized she was crying, hot tears streaming down her face. She felt broken, betrayed, not just by Richard, but by Tom, by the life she'd thought she was building. She didn't know how long she sat there, but when Tom came home, she was still on the floor, the papers scattered around her. He froze in the doorway, his face pale. "Em, what's wrong?" he asked, but there was an edge to his voice, like he already knew. She looked up at him, her eyes burning, and the words poured out, everything she'd held back, every fear, every doubt. She told him about Richard's visit, his threat, the way he'd looked at the papers like they were a fuse he couldn't let her light. "He's hiding something, Tom," she said, her voice raw. "Something bad, and you're letting him." Tom's face crumpled, and for a moment she thought he might break, might finally listen. But then his expression hardened, and he shook his head. "You're wrong," he said, his voice tight. "Dad's not perfect, but he's not whatever you think he is. You're obsessed, Em. You're tearing us apart over nothing." He turned away, his shoulders rigid, and walked upstairs, leaving her alone with the papers and the dog's distant howls. That was the moment Emily snapped, not with anger, but with clarity. She couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't live in this house. Couldn't stay with a man who chose his father over her. Couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. She grabbed the photo, the letters, and her laptop, and started typing, searching for anything that could confirm what she already suspected. Hours later, she found it. An old forum post, buried deep in a true crime thread, from someone claiming to be Margaret's cousin. The post was vague but chilling, mentioning a man Margaret had been afraid of, someone close to her, someone she'd trusted. No name, but the dates lined up. The house lined up. Richard lined up. Then came the twist, the one that turned her world upside down. Among the letters, tucked in an envelope she hadn't noticed before, was a note in different handwriting. Tom's. It was short, scrawled in a hurry. "Dad, we need to talk about her. I can't keep this quiet forever." Emily's breath stopped. Tom knew. He'd known all along, or at least suspected, and he'd said nothing. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Richard had done, a knife to her heart that left her gasping. She didn't confront Tom that night. She couldn't. Instead, she packed a bag, grabbed Max, and left, driving to a motel on the edge of town. The dog curled up in the passenger seat, his eyes soft, like he understood. As the neon lights of the motel flickered against the fog, Emily sat on the bed, the letters spread out before her, and made a decision. She wasn't running away. She was going to find the truth, no matter what it cost. Richard had taken enough from her. And Tom? Tom had broken her heart. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. What had they done to Margaret Klein? And how far would they go to keep it hidden? The motel room smelled of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. But to Emily, it was a sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe without the weight of that house pressing down on her. Max lay at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, his eyes watching her with a quiet trust that anchored her. The letters, the photo, and Tom's damning note were spread out on the wobbly desk, their edges curling in the dim light. Emily hadn't slept, not really, just brief, fitful moments where her mind replayed Richard's threat, Tom's betrayal, and the ghost of Margaret Klein, a woman she'd never met, but now felt tethered to. She wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was clear. She couldn't go back. Not to the house, not to Tom, not to the life she'd thought was hers. The first few days in the motel were a haze of research and resolve. Emily poured herself into finding answers, her laptop screen a blur of old articles, public records, and obscure forums. She reached out to the person who'd posted about Margaret's cousin, a woman named Lisa, and after a cautious email exchange, they agreed to meet. Lisa lived an hour away, in a small town that felt like a mirror of the one Emily had fled. Their meeting was brief, tense, held in a diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like regret. Lisa was in her 50s, her face lined with grief that hadn't faded in 20 years. She confirmed what Emily had pieced together. Margaret had been scared in the months before she vanished. She'd mentioned a man, someone she'd trusted, someone who'd turned controlling, possessive. Lisa didn't know his name, but the way she described him, tall, commanding, with a charm that could turn cold, matched Richard perfectly. "She wrote me a letter once," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said she was going to confront him, tell him to leave her alone. That was the last I heard from her." Lisa's eyes glistened, and Emily felt a pang of guilt for stirring up old wounds. But she pressed on, showing Lisa the photo of Richard and Margaret. Lisa's face paled. "That's her," she said, her voice breaking. "And him. I've seen him before, in town years ago. He was always around her." It was the confirmation Emily needed, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a door swinging open to a darker room. She thanked Lisa, promised to keep her updated, and drove back to the motel, her mind racing. Richard had known Margaret, maybe loved her, maybe hurt her. And Tom, her Tom, the man she'd vowed to build a life with, had known something, enough to write that note, enough to keep silent. The betrayal cut deeper every time she thought about it, a wound that refused to heal. Emily knew she couldn't stay in the motel forever. Her savings were thin, and the questions were piling up faster than the answers. She started reaching out to others, old neighbors, former colleagues of Margaret's, anyone who might remember something. Most didn't want to talk, their voices tight with fear or indifference. But one name kept coming up. Daniel, a retired deputy who'd worked on Margaret's case. Emily tracked him down to a nursing home, his hands gnarled but his mind sharp. He remembered the case vividly, his eyes clouding when she mentioned Richard. "We looked at him," Daniel said, his voice raspy. "He had an alibi. Tight, too tight if you ask me. Said he was out of town, had witnesses. But there was something off about him. Always calm, too calm. And that dog of his, Max, was it? That dog wouldn't go near him. I never forgot that." Emily's heart skipped. Max. The dog had known, even then. Daniel didn't have proof, just suspicions. But he gave her a lead. A storage unit Margaret had rented, one the police had overlooked. It was a long shot, but Emily clung to it like a lifeline. The storage unit was in a run-down facility on the edge of town, its gate rusted, its lights flickering. Emily went alone, Max waiting in the car, his whines echoing as she walked away. The manager, a bored man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, handed her a key after she showed him a forged letter claiming she was Margaret's niece. The unit was small, crammed with boxes compensation, boxes of clothes, books, and a locked metal box that made Emily's pulse quicken. She pried it open, her hands trembling, and found a journal. Margaret's journal. Pages filled with her thoughts, her fears, her life. And there, in black ink, was Richard's name, circled, underlined, paired with words like afraid and won't stop. One entry, dated a week before she vanished, read, "I told him it's over. He said I'd regret it. I'm scared he meant it." Emily sat in the storage unit, the journal in her lap, and cried. Not for herself, but for Margaret, for the life stolen from her, for the truth buried under years of lies. She didn't know if Richard had killed her, but she knew he'd destroyed her, and that was enough. She took the journal, locked the unit, and drove back to the motel, her resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for answers now, she was fighting for justice. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Tom showed up at the motel, his face haggard, his eyes red. He'd found her through a mutual friend, he said, and he needed to talk. Emily let him in, Max growling softly at her side, but she didn't send the dog away. Tom looked at the papers on the desk, the journal among them, and his shoulders slumped. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "Not for sure, but I suspected. Years ago, I overheard Dad on the phone, arguing about her. He sounded wrong. I asked him once, and he told me never to bring it up again. I was a kid, Em. I didn't know what to do. You knew enough, Emily said, her voice cold. You wrote that note. You could have told me. You could have done something. Tom flinched, tears spilling down his cheeks, but Emily didn't soften. She couldn't. Not anymore. He begged her to come back, to work things out, but she shook her head. I'm done, Tom. With you. With him. With all of it. He left, his sobs echoing in the hallway, and Emily felt a strange relief. She was free. She didn't confront Richard, not directly. Instead, she took the journal, the letters, and the photo to the police, along with Lisa's testimony and Daniel's suspicions. The case was reopened, though the detective warned her it might not go anywhere. Too much time had passed. Too little evidence remained. But Emily didn't need a conviction. She needed the truth to breathe, to live, to haunt Richard the way he'd haunted her. She moved to Chicago, back to her old life, but not her old self. She was stronger now, sharper, her heart scarred but whole. Max came with her, his loyalty a reminder that some bonds couldn't be broken. Months later, she heard from Lisa. Richard had left town, his house sold, his name whispered in corners but never loudly. No charges were filed, but the rumors were enough to unravel his carefully built facade. Tom reached out once, a letter filled with apologies, but Emily didn't reply. She didn't hate him, but she didn't need him. She was building something new, something hers. On quiet nights, when the city hummed outside her window, Emily would sit with Max, his head in her lap, and think about Margaret. She'd never know the full story, but she'd given her a voice, a legacy. And that was enough. The dog had known, from the start, and in the end, Emily had listened. Some truths couldn't stay buried, no matter how deep you dug. And some fights were worth having, no matter how much they cost.